Hello everyone, I'm Ouhao Chen. I'm a lecturer in Math Education Center, Loughborough University. Today I'm going to present how could we apply cognitive load theory to teach mathematics. In my presentation, there are two chapters. For the chapter 1, I will introduce the theoretical base of cognitive load theory. And in chapter 2, I will introduce types of cognitive load and also some famous cognitive load effects. So now let's move to the chapter 1. At the beginning of the chapter 1, I would like to ask everyone these two questions. What type of knowledge could be taught and what type of knowledge doesn't need to be taught? I'm wondering how many of you have ever considered to categorize knowledge first and then to design instructions. If so, you may have answers for these two questions. If not, probably you can start considering what type of knowledge we should teach and what type of knowledge we don't need to teach. Why I'm asking these two questions? Because in CLT, we think without a clear categorization of knowledge, our instructional designs will be random. Therefore, the very first task in CLT is going to have a clear idea about types of knowledge. In CLT, we have borrowed the knowledge categorization from David Gary. Actually, there are many ways to categorize knowledge, but only the categorization from David Gary has great impact on pedagogy and instructional designs. Therefore, in CLT, we categorize knowledge into biological primary knowledge and biological secondary knowledge. So for the biological primary knowledge, this type of knowledge we don't need to teach because as human beings, we have evolved to acquire biological primary knowledge. This knowledge actually is the generic cognitive skills. For example, problem solving, constructing knowledge. However, for the biological secondary knowledge, this type of knowledge must be taught in schools. So that's why we build schools and we build educational institutes to teach secondary knowledge. And this type of knowledge actually is domain-specific skills and domain-specific knowledge. For example, in mathematics, we have to or we must teach a student about solving an equation, because solving an equation, this type of skill couldn't be evolved to acquire. Therefore, a teacher must teach how to solve an equation. Therefore, for the primary knowledge, we don't need to teach, but for the secondary knowledge, we must teach. Therefore, the goal of CLT, firstly, in CLT, we focus on biological secondary knowledge. We design effective instructions to teach biological secondary knowledge rather than biological primary knowledge. Therefore, we design instructions for knowledge and skills are taught in schools. Also, in CLT, we focus on procedural knowledge, which is far more complex than conceptual knowledge. Before we are going to talk about cognitive load effects or the cognitive load, I think it's very good to understand the human cognitive architecture, because this architecture is the base of CLT, and also this texture tells us how information is processed between working memory and long-term memory. Also, under this architecture, we have 5 principles which shows very important instructional functions. So for the first principle is information store principle. This principle shows every student must have stored a lot of information or knowledge in their long-term memory in order to solve problems. If students don't have stored a lot of information or schemas, knowledge in their long-term memory, they couldn't solve problems. However, how could we acquire such a large amount of knowledge to be stored in our long-term memory? The effective and efficient way is going to borrow the knowledge from others. For example, in the classroom, we borrow the knowledge from teachers. And once the knowledge is borrowed, the knowledge could be reorganized and be ready to stored in long-term memory. However, if the knowledge couldn't be borrowed, for example, the knowledge doesn't exist to borrow, what should we do? We could randomly generate the new knowledge based on our prior experiences. And once the new knowledge has been generated, we need to test the effectiveness of the new knowledge. If the new knowledge is effective, we will transfer the knowledge to long-term memory for storage. If the new knowledge is not effective, we will discuss. We will get rid of the new knowledge. However, as we know, our working memory has very limited capacity. Therefore, for new information processed in working memory, the amount of new information cannot be very large, because if we present or process a large amount of new information in working memory, which will overload the working memory capacity. However, if we retrieve the stored information from long-term memory to working memory, which means we are going to process some well-organized knowledge from long-term memory, and the working memory doesn't have any limited capacity. Therefore, the limited capacity of working memory only apply to new information, new knowledge. Once the knowledge has been stored in long-term memory, as I mentioned before, we could retrieve the new knowledge from long-term memory to solve the math problem or other problems. So that reflects the last principle, environmental organizing and linking principle. And I want to emphasize, all of the 5 principles belong to biological primary knowledge, which means we don't need to teach students about the 5 skills. They know how to use the 5 skills, and they have evolved to acquire these 5 skills. Okay, so after introducing the knowledge categorization and human cognitive architecture, and to end the chapter 1, I would like to bring up a discussion. This statement has been in education for decades. It says it is difficult for some students learning in the school, and it is easy for students to learn the knowledge, which is far more complex outside the school. Therefore, we should teach the same way in schools as the ways outside of schools. So I want to ask everyone, is the argument true, or how should we consider this a statement or argument? In CLT, we think from the perspective of cognitive load theory, we think this statement is not correct because as based on the knowledge categorization, the knowledge taught in school is totally different from the knowledge we learn outside of school. Therefore, the way we teach students in schools definitely are different from the way we teach children outside of schools. Therefore, we don't think this argument is true. But if you have more thoughts, or if you want to discuss with me about your thoughts, please do email me, and I'm very happy to hear from all of you, and also very happy to have some further discussion about your ideas. So this is the end of chapter 1, and now we are going to move to chapter 2. The chapter 2, firstly, I'm going to introduce some instructional effects and also types of cognitive load. And to end the chapter 2, I'm going to introduce some new directions under the cognitive load theory framework. So the first effect I would like to introduce is work example effect. This effect is very, very famous and classic in cognitive load theory. I would say this is the core effect in cognitive load theory. So work example effect suggests we need to show students how to solve a problem rather than ask students to generate solutions by themselves, which means please do not withhold information, but we need to present information to our students. And we found using work examples is more efficient and superior to engage in problem solving. This effect actually reflects the borrowing and reorganizing principle, because we borrow the knowledge directly from teachers. And as I mentioned before, borrowing knowledge is primary knowledge. So borrowing is a biological primary skill. We don't need to teach. Students know how to borrow knowledge from others. However, the work example effect. However, the work example effect probably only works for novices, but for more knowledgeable learners, using work examples may not be very effective. I will talk about that later. So now I'm going to show you how an example looks like. So for example, we're going to teach students how to solve this equation, and you can say we actually present each step to students, and the student could borrow the knowledge from this work example. As I mentioned before, however, using work examples are not always effective. Therefore, we need to consider some design issues to make the example more effective. Therefore, we have the split attention effect. I understand most of teachers already have known the split attention effect, but probably some of you may not know. So I think it's worth to introduce this effect. So you can see on the left side, this design actually is very textbook based. So in the normal textbook, we actually separate the geometry shape from the solution. However, in CLT, we suggest we need to integrate the solution within the geometry shape. Why? Because on the left side, if we present the material, on the left to our students need to search the information up and down. the searching could impose cognitive load. However, if we integrate the geometry shape with solutions, students don't need to search information. They just need to read the information on the diagrams. Therefore, the CLT design on the right could reduce cognitive load. But physically integrating two resources of information is not always effective. For example, if the two resources of information tell the same thing, we shouldn't integrate, which is redundant. For example, a table and the textual information. If the textual information and the table, they tell the same story, please do not integrate the textual information within the table, which will be redundant. So we just need to present either of them, which is fine. This effect actually doesn't follow our intuition, because we always think it is good to present the same thing multiple ways. However, redundancy effect tells it is not really. The next effect is also very important. It is called as expertise reversal effect. So using work examples, as I mentioned before, the work example effect works very well for novices. However, the work examples do not work very well for experts or knowledgeable learners. So as I mentioned here, the learner's expertise also moderates the effectiveness of work examples. For novices, using work examples are effective, but for knowledgeable learners, the same work examples could hinder the learning, showing the expertise reversal effect. Therefore, for novices, we encourage using work examples. However, for more knowledgeable learners, we encourage problem solving. Therefore, you can say in cognitive load theory, we don't exclude problem solving, just we need to include, or we need to introduce problem solving at the right stage. The next effect is element interactivity effect. This effect is also very basic and very important, because it relates to element interactivity. So what is element interactivity? Element interactivity shows the degree of interconnectedness of elements. And an element could be a knowledge, could be a concept. For example, if we ask students to memorize cat, dog, flower, this kind of material belongs to materials lowering element interactivity, because students could memorize or learn the three words individually. They could learn cat without referring to the dog, and they can learn dog without referring to flower. Therefore, they could learn the three words individually and separately. However, if we ask students to solve the equation 3x minus 7 equals 8 for x, this kind of material belongs to materials high in element interactivity. Because for this situation, we couldn't process 3x minus 7 equals 8, the 6 math symbols individually and separately. If we process the 6 symbols individually and separately, we couldn't understand this math problem. We couldn't understand and we couldn't know how to solve this equation. So that's why we have to process the 6 math symbols in our working memory simultaneously in order to know how to solve this equation. Therefore, for the first example, the cat dog flower, this material, the element interactivity actually as low as 1, because we process one word at one time. However, for the second material, solving this equation, actually the element interactivity as high as 6 at least. There are 6 elements are interactive. Therefore, this material actually is much more complex for our students. So based on my explanation before, for the materials lowering element interactivity, work example is not effective because work examples are used to teach complex material. So in order to learn the materials lowering element interactivity, we should encourage students to generate the answers. Therefore, we suggest problem solving. However, for materials far more complex, like solving this equation, we definitely encourage using work example because using work example for complex material is far more effective than generation or problem solving. The next effect I would like to introduce is isolate element effect. All of the effects I introduced before is going to reduce the extraneous load, but for the isolated element effect, this effect actually is going to alter the intrinsic load. I will talk about what is extraneous load and what is intrinsic load soon. So for this effect, there are 2 phases to design by using isolate element effect. The first phase, we need to break down the complex problem into simpler, easier ones. So which means we break down the complex problem into some small and easier pieces. However, we must combine the simpler and easier pieces together by the end as the complex problem to teach. We couldn't only teach the simpler, easier ones, because if we only teach simpler, easier ones, the student can only form individual and isolated schemas. So that's why we must combine the easier pieces by the end in order to help students to form the complete picture of the complex problem in order to connect all of the simple pieces as a whole schema. So this is the design if we use isolate element effect, and also this effect shows we could alter the intrinsic load. For the first phase, actually, we reduce the intrinsic load first, and then we increase the intrinsic load by the end. Okay, so I mentioned the extraneous load and intrinsic load. So what is intrinsic load and what is extraneous load? And how many types of cognitive load we now using in CLT? So firstly, the intrinsic load. The intrinsic load depends on the nature of learning materials and also the levels of element interactivity. Actually, the levels of element interactivity determine the levels of intrinsic load. If the learning material belongs to low element interactivity material, which means this material has very low level intrinsic load. However, if the materials are high in element interactivity, which means this material will impose very high level of intrinsic load on our working memory. Normally, the intrinsic is fixed and couldn't be changed because once we have chosen a specific material, the intrinsic load is fixed. And also, the intrinsic load depends on learner's expertise. For example, if we ask novices to solve 3x minus 7 equals 8, which will impose very high levels of intrinsic load. But if we ask knowledgeable learners or experts to solve the same equation, which will become a very simple question, a simple problem. Therefore, intrinsic load depends on the levels of element interactivity and also the levels of learner's expertise. The next load is extraneous load. This load depends on the design of instruction. So which means the design, how you are going to design the instruction will determine how much extraneous load will impose on our students' working memory. And I would say most or maybe 90% of cognitive load effects are used to reduce the extraneous load. Because extraneous load, I would say, is a negative load we need to reduce or minimize. But for the intrinsic load, the intrinsic load actually is a positive load we need to maximize. And of course, we don't know whether we can really minimize the extraneous load to the level of 0. Probably we can, but we haven't actually measured how low level of extraneous load could be. But once we have started using cognitive load effects to design our instruction, the extraneous load is always very low. Therefore, extraneous load could be altered. And also, we need to clear, once you are going to use one of the cognitive load effects, which means you are going to manipulate extraneous load rather than intrinsic load. So please do not confuse, oh, I'm going to use CLT, I'm going to use cognitive load theory, which means I'm going to teach something simpler, I'm going to teach something less complex. That is not right, because in CLT we only interest in complex problems, complex materials. We just to generate instructions to facilitate our teaching for complex materials, because our working memory capacity is limited. If we use CLT effect to reduce extraneous load, actually we free more working memory resources to deal with the intrinsic load. Therefore, we always design instructions to reduce extraneous load in order to have more working memory resources to deal with intrinsic load for transfer and schema acquisition and schema optimization. Therefore, please do not confuse CLT. CLT is going to ask us to teach simple materials, which is totally wrong, because we only focus on complex material. As I said, the intrinsic load is normally fixed and could be changed, but we can use some ways to change our instructions in order to reduce the load. but we still teach complex problems. And also, a few years ago, at the beginning of the cognitive load theory, we talk about the German load. However, we are considering the German load. Probably we probably couldn't talk about the German load separately, because the German load now is considered as part of intrinsic load. The German load actually, or we say the German resources, that are resources to form schema, to automate our schema. Therefore, that belongs to intrinsic load, because intrinsic load is positive load, and the German load is also positive load. It's also positive load we need. But the extraneous load is negative load. We must reduce and minimize. Therefore, to summarize these slides, the cognitive load effects introduced before are all for reducing the extraneous load, because CLT is for instructions. But I mentioned before the isolate element effect. We could use the isolated element effect to reduce the intrinsic load, but we need to reduce the intrinsic load first and then increase the intrinsic load by the end. Another question, another research area in CLT, and we have a lot of debate, we have a lot of discussion and arguments, is about the measuring cognitive load. This area is still, we are still developing this area, and we hope we could find a very objective and accurate measurements to measure cognitive load. But so far, we have some ways to measure the cognitive load. The first one is the PASS scale. The PASS scale, you can say here, actually this scale is a self-report. So we ask students to self-report how much effort they used to solve this problem, or how much effort they used to learn examples. So they could choose one of the number between 1 and 9. This measurement is very sensitive. However, these measurements can only tell us the total load, the total amount of load. Yes, we couldn't distinguish types of load by using PASS scale. Therefore, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Jimmy Lepkin developed a questionnaire and to distinguish types of loads. This questionnaire is 10-item questionnaire, and you can use this questionnaire to measure intrinsic extraneous loads. However, based on the results, this questionnaire may not be very sensitive to measure German load. So here is the sample of this questionnaire. And another way is going to measure cognitive load by using very advanced technology. For example, we use some technology to measure the heart rate, the pupil size. These ways are very objective and accurate, and probably we could further investigate how to use the physiological measurements to measure and to distinguish types of cognitive load. Okay, and at the end, I would like to introduce some new areas of cognitive load theory. Firstly, Swiller and his colleagues published a review paper to review the results of 20 years of cognitive load theory. So they summarized how cognitive load theory has been developed during the 20 years. So the new areas in cognitive load theory, firstly, how could connect motivation to cognitive load? How self-regulation could be connected to cognitive load? And lastly, in CLT, we have suggested a new cognitive load effect called the working memory resources depletion effect. For the motivation research, a very famous professor in University of New South Wales, Australia, called Andrew Martin, he has already started doing some research to connect cognitive load and motivation. Here is a paper he published with the British Psychological Society. And another professor from Germany, she has done a lot of work to talk about self-regulation and cognitive load. And of course, my research team and I, we suggested a new cognitive load effect called the working memory resource depletion effect. And if you are interested in this new effect, you could read our paper. And also, we very happy to have more people to get involved in this research line. Finally, I would like to emphasize or to emphasize one thing. Cognitive load theory is not a theory for all, because a lot of people in educational research, in math education, they probably think cognitive load theory could be used to address everything in learning. But please remember, and please keep in mind, cognitive load theory is not a theory for all. And also, cognitive load theory is not a motivation theory. Therefore, cognitive load theory is here to deal with instruction design. It's going to deal with cognition issue. So please remember, and please remember, we are not a theory for all. So we probably couldn't solve all of the problems, but we are happy to solve part of them. So I think, yeah, I think I may stop here. And if you are interested in my talk, if you are very interested in my talk, please do contact with me. And I'm very happy to talk with local teachers about your experiences, and also how could we apply cognitive load theory or other learning theories into your classrooms. Okay, so I think I may stop here, and thanks for your attention. Bye bye.